All right, what's going on, everybody? If anybody's even here, we'll see if anybody joins. We are running extremely late on our broadcast here because I apparently don't know how to run my own calendar. So here we are. Had a little calendar snafu. Thought we were starting this thing at 11 my time. Apparently it's at 10. So if anybody joins, we are running. Let me turn off my audio here on my phone where I'm running my LinkedIn chat. So what's up, everybody? Glad to be back. And we are talking about conversation magnets. And no, they are not the same thing as lead magnets. And that is part of what we're going to dig into today. So here we go. We all, I think, pretty consistently hear from the gurus in the peanut gallery, if you will, this whole thing of, gated content sucks. And yes, sort of. And the interesting thing I find is many of the same people who say that are also the ones who are doing things like creating a guide of some sort, posting a post on LinkedIn about it and saying, make a comment below and I'll DM it to you. What's the difference? That's literally gated content, just in maybe a more socially acceptable way as far as how things are these days. So what I'm getting at is it's not the content itself, and it's not the gating even of said content itself. It's that the reason that gated content, quote unquote, sucks isn't the fact that it's gated per se, but how it's gated, how it's used and promoted, and then what happens after the gate, after the download, or after the access is granted. That's the issue, right? I mean, we see kind of the anecdote illustrated in who's it, Hockey Stack, I think, put out their first commercial, right? And it sort of really makes fun of what we would traditionally call gated content. Now, I'm not here to tell you, hey, you should gate a bunch of content. Don't agree with that. I think most content should be ungated. I don't want to get into that discussion. Me and James and Joseph had a deep dive into that, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 months ago on this show. We can link to that episode in the comments. Otherwise, you can find it in our YouTube archives and all that fun stuff, and on our site. It literally is called To Gate or Not to Gate. So if you're interested in that conversation, check that out. I'm not going to belabor that point. For the folks that say things like, never gate any content or gated content sucks, my general advice to people listening to that is, anyone who speaks in absolutes is likely trying to scam you, or at least they're trying to sell you something. Right? The reality is the world is full of nuance, and whether that be in marketing and business and life, in science and whatever, there virtually are no absolutes. It's always a lot of nuance. And I think this conversation right now will illustrate some of that as it pertains to gated content. The reason why people say gated content sucks, there is the way we see it right now play out is a couple of things. One is there's often a growth plateau that a business hits. And oftentimes it's a company that's grown based on like their reputation, the work that they've done, the products that they've created. So maybe it's kind of a PLG motion even, or a sales led motion, more of kind of that one-to-one type thing. And they plateau because what they're doing right now no longer scales in an efficient way. So their automatic solution is based on what I hear out there from gurus and things like that. Well, I got to fill the top of my funnel. I need more at bats. I need more awareness. I need more leads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they move to, the lowest hanging fruit, if you will, which is some sort of gated content. It's an ebook, it's a webinar, or whatever, right? Before I go into the problem with that, the other thing is it creates poor unit economics often once you do that, right? You end up building an unscalable model, even though that's what you're doing it for. You're doing it for scalable growth. The reality is you end up building a model that as you dump more money into it, your unit economics actually get worse. So what do you do about that? Well, I want to tell you a couple of stories about gated content and how it can actually work. But before I do, I think, the title here, and when we think about the mindset here that we want to talk about, is it's about conversations. If you think about your content, not even just gated content, but about your content, and ask yourself a core question, which is, would somebody want to have a conversation about this? If that is your mindset, the way you're going to execute, both the type of content you're going to create, how you're going to promote said content, and if you gate it, what happens after, all the tactical stuff around that is going to change. If you have the mindset of starting conversations and asking yourself that question, which is, will somebody want to have a conversation about this? There are a few other questions you have to ask, but I'll mention those in a second. So why conversations? Well, if you think about it, conversations are the building blocks of relationships. And this show is called Relationship-Led Growth Live. You've probably pretty consistently seen and heard me and folks on our team talk about relationship-led growth and the benefits of relationships and the scalability of relationships and referrals that come out of them, all those things, right? But how do you build relationships? The building blocks to a relationship is conversations. So if your content can help start conversations, that becomes a building block to building those relationships at scale. What are the types of conversations we're talking about? So it could be a one-to-one conversation, meaning, okay, somebody downloads or something you posted, somebody attends your webinar, somebody listens to your podcast, somebody reads an article, whatever it may be, somebody joins your community and they decide to reach out and have a one-on-one conversation with you. Could be that. It could be one of few conversations, which is a number of people listening to your show and then having a conversation about it. It could be community stuff really plays into that, podcast, etc. It could be conversations that are spurred by your content within your target accounts. Really important thing to remember. It could also be conversations spurred about you amongst the industry ecosystem. So influencers, formal and kind of informal, if you will, consultants, tangential partners or potential partners, all that kind of stuff. So that's why asking yourself about conversations is important. Is it going to start a conversation? And then that's where we get into kind of this mindset again of, well, is there really a difference between a conversation magnet and a lead magnet? Like, it seems like it's the same thing. Well, if you think about it tactically, maybe. But it's the mindset that matters. If your goal is to try to start a conversation, that piece of content is likely going to be different. The execution might seem like it's the same, or the tactic, like it might be a webinar, okay, that somebody has to sign up to get access to or watch later. Not saying you should gate all your past webinars, but let's assume that's what you're doing. The content itself within that webinar will be different. How you present it will be different. Maybe even who you invite will be different. Who the presenter is might be different. You know, for example, a lot of companies will will have their sales team run their webinars because they're thinking, how can I make the sale? Stop thinking about how can you make the sale and start thinking about how can you build a relationship? How can you start a conversation? Right, so that changes things. So, all right. Philosophy, if you will, aside, I want to tell you about 4 stories, a few of our own with client examples and a few that I've personally experienced with vendors and partners we currently work with that illustrate some of these points. So the first one is, it's an operations company, operations consulting company. And at one point when we were working through some of our operations rebuilds and improvements, I was doing some research. We're potentially looking at working with an external partner to help with some of these things. And this company happened to have a guide. And they had a really good hook that they wrote for it. It was a really great title. And I figured I'd check it out. And I believe, if I remember correctly, the guide was actually ungated. I don't remember off the top of my head right now. So I downloaded the guide. I shared that guide internally with my team after I looked at it. It was like a 40 or 50 page guide, very detailed, very useful, had a bunch of CTAs and like to-dos that you might want to do with your team as you're doing this, right? So it was a natural internal conversation starter. So I posted it in our Slack channels, shared it with our director of operations at the time, and we had a quick back and forth around it and moved on. That guide also included a link, if my memory serves, to an assessment, which the assessment was actually gated. So I'm like, yeah, what the heck? Seems interesting. We're trying to figure this out. Why not? Let me see what our setup looks like according to their assessment. Took the assessment. Assessment was gated. That yet spurred another conversation. And I shared this. We had an external conversation about this specific vendor with somebody we knew that was actually working with them. We didn't ask them for that referral. We just went like, hey, we know you're working with these guys. We took their assessment, we downloaded their thing. What do you think? Have you seen the benefits, etc. Then we reached out to them and we had a sales conversation. So conversation, internal conversation, external conversation, and then a sales conversation with these folks. The reality is we never talked to sales. We were not ready to have a sales conversation until we did all these other things. So we had all these other conversations. But what spurred them was in part some gated content. It was cleverly gated. They followed it up with some value add emails of like how to, I think one of them was how to read the assessment itself and what to do about it and that kind of stuff. Now we ended up working with them for a variety of reasons, but the point is we might still in the future actually, but that's example number one. Another one is a company in the benefits space. They are currently a vendor of ours actually. And when we were researching how to provide healthcare benefits, there was we got a recommendation from somebody that we should do an HRA. Was doing some research on what that is, how it's administered, what are some of the gotchas, if you will, what are some things we need to know. And this company happened to have, I believe it was the #1 result in Google, but also their article was probably the most in depth, which is probably why it was the #1 result, and answered a lot of my questions. At the same time, they had a very clear CTA in that article, not to talk to them, but hey, you should talk to your CPA or your legal advisor about what this means, compliance, that kind of stuff. So we did. I reached out to our CPA firm and I said, hey, we're thinking of doing this. What do you know about it? What do we need to know about it? Does it make sense? Do we need to change anything on our end if we are to do this? All this kind of stuff. which led to an internal conversation that we had with another CPA firm. They pretty much said, yep, here's what you need to do. This is good stuff. You should talk to them. And then, oh, by the way, once you do, get us involved. So that's exactly what we did. And we've been using this service for the last, I think 3 years now, probably. So again, the sales conversation and the sales inbound outreach from us didn't happen until much, much, much later, when we did all sorts of other things and until we had other conversations. But the relationship was starting to be built through these conversations based on, in this case, actually ungated content, but it's still an important thing to mention. I do think actually they had some piece of gated content we also downloaded as well, also some sort of guide as I think back at it. There's a couple of client examples. A client that's in the past client, actually, that's in the manufacturing space, like technology manufacturing space. And we were getting them set up with what we call a relationship enablement framework. So it's focused on live events like this and all sorts of things. And very early on, might have been webinar number 1 and number 2. I mean, they had great signups, great attendance as well, compared to kind of what we see in the industry. That relates to the way we promoted it and the quality of the content, things like that. But very early on, there was a good conversation that started in the chats of one of these webinars, which led to somebody offering to make a referral or an intro. That referral was made, and that led to a sales, a business conversation. From there, if I remember correctly, they had a contract out pretty quickly after that. So another example of the webinar itself was gated to attend, and from there, things evolved: one-to-few conversation, external conversation, one-to-one sales conversation. Another example, and this will be the last one that I share, is a company in the medtech space, medtech services. This one was much more straightforward, more traditional, if you will, that you would think kind of gated content would be. But again, the mindset was very specific. Yes, it was kind of your basic guide, fairly simple. It was a tactical guide to a specific activity that somebody that's creating medical devices would need to go through. I think it was a 1 or 2 page document that kind of went through how to do it, pitfalls. Pretty much you could fill this out. Right? The idea there was we'd follow it up with some podcasts around the same topic, which we did, and then follow up with some targeted sales outreach saying, hey, if you downloaded this, would you like some help talking through it? Here's some core pitfalls that you might be going through as you're doing it. Maybe some things you don't generally think through. We can walk you through that. Not a sales conversation, strictly an offer to help. And that led to inevitably sales conversations down the road. So, the basic responses might be, well, yeah, everybody talks about creating valuable content. And that's what, as long as it's valuable, you can get it. I would argue that's not enough. Because you can have the most valuable piece of content out there. If it's not a piece of content that helps you start conversations, you're not actually helping your pipeline. You're not actually helping pipeline velocity. And you might even be attracting the completely wrong people. Sure, they might have the problem. They might be looking to solve the problem that you can help solve, but they're not actually in your ICP. Because it's not something they're willing to have a conversation about. And they're not interested to have a conversation about. It's also not giving you the right intent, right? So if it's not something they want to have a conversation about, they're probably not in buying mode and likely won't be in the near future, right? Now, yes, you want to educate others that are maybe not in buying mode just yet, But the further down you can get, the more impact you can have in the shorter term. So again, what this gets to is you really need to have a relationship mindset and focus on the activity and not the outcome. So you probably heard me say this before. It's that revenue is an outcome of great relationships. So don't focus on the revenue. Focus on building relationships. You build relationships through conversation. Already mentioned that today. So focus on the activity and activities that help you have more and more conversations. You can do a lot of that through content, some of which can, and I will argue even should, be gated in one way, shape, or form. Again, I will remind you that gating doesn't just mean gated by a form. Yes, it could be that, but it's also a gate when you, again, create something, post it on LinkedIn and request that people leave a comment before you DM it to them. It's still gated. You're just gating it in a different way. You can do a partial gate, right? You give part of it for free, and hey, if you want the whole thing, you can download it here and just give us your email, kind of thing, right? Again, if you want more detail on gating versus ungating, we have a whole other episode which we talked about. I believe James posted a link to it, so check it out there. Check it out in the comments here. So again, focus on having this relationship mindset allows you to not only create better content, but also a better promotional plan for said content and a better follow-up strategy to said content if it's gated. So there are specific skills that you really are going to need to develop to do this well if you don't yet have them. Okay. The specific skill really is, if the goal is to create content that starts conversations, you need to become a good conversationalist. Now, doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a good conversationalist in a live situation, although it does help, I believe. But it's things like writing a good hook, headline, and title. That becomes critical. And I'm not talking about clickbait, right? You don't want to bait and switch somebody. But being able to write a good hook, headline, or title makes all the difference for your social content, your gated content, your webinars, or live events, your podcast episodes, all of these things. If you want to be able to get people to attend, to consume, and then start conversations, the first step is to get them excited about it, and you do that by having a good hook, headline, or title. The other thing is, and I mentioned this first question already, you really have to ask yourself 3 questions. Number 1 is, would someone want to have a conversation about this? So again, you can have the most valuable piece of content, but if it's not something somebody wants to talk about, you might not, it's probably not enough. Because everybody's out there trying to quote unquote add value and do the skyscraper strategy for their organic content or even their social content, do the value add strategy for their social content. I mean, all that kind of stuff. Everyone's trying to do that. So you're just adding to the noise to a certain extent, but really focusing on, will somebody want to have a conversation with me, either inbound or out, or be more willing to have one outbound if I follow up. And that's the way to, I think about gated content is, it's not just an inbound strategy. It should also help and accelerate your outbound strategy. The other question is, can I or someone else on my team have a good intro conversation about this? So a lot of people will, make, again, their sales team be involved. And maybe that's the right thing to do, but maybe it's not in certain instances. If your salesperson is not really the expert in a particular thing, it might be an expert in your product. It might even be an overarching thought leader in the industry. But if it's something in detail that they're not the best person to have an intro conversation, maybe it shouldn't be them. Maybe it should be your engineer or your developer or your CTO or your CEO or whatever. Okay. So deciding who the right person is also critical. And if it's nobody, this gets us to the third question. Is there an external party or influencer that needs to guide this conversation? And again, you want to be thinking about the broader ecosystem when you're thinking about not just your content, but your go-to-market strategy as a whole. That's what relationship-led growth is all about. You're going to want to rethink what gated content actually means. Because again, I don't think that any of us are going to argue that the traditional, lead gen ebook approach, funnel-based approach to gated content does not work, and it sucks, and it's awful. Right? Again, I'll point you to the commercial that Hockey Stack just put out. I'm not an advisor or anything like that to them. We don't even use their product. The commercial is funny. It's a great piece of content. Watch it if you can. Highly recommend it. But what they're making fun of, yes, it's awful. It's bad. Don't do it. But that doesn't mean that gating content itself is bad. And again, I'll point you to the episode we had about this that's already linked here. But as a mindset and a concept, I would say stop thinking about it as gated content, but think about it as gated experiences, because it's more than just ebooks or guides. It's webinars, it's subscriber-only podcast feeds, if that's something you're going to do. It's calculators, it's online assessments, all these types of things where gating might actually be a feature or a benefit to the consumer. That's great. Do that. So think about it in a broader sense as an experience, a content-based experience, if you will, rather than just gated content. Because when people say gated content, what they really mean is gated ebooks. So let's just leave it at that. If you make this shift, if you build these skill sets internally or bring in resources externally to your team, you're going to have more conversations. You are going to drive more referrals. And if you want details on referrals, I had a whole episode around the referral flywheel model that we built, which is part of and is the core concept of our relationship-led growth framework. There's a whole episode there. And it's also going to shorten your sales cycles, because what this does is it starts conversations. If it starts conversations, people to get in your network, in your orbit faster. It creates more referrals, which referrals are more likely to convert to business and to move faster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And if you think back to some of the examples I gave earlier, that's exactly what was happening there. So I'm going to start wrapping up this concept here, and I'll open it up for questions. When you focus on relationships, magic things happen. When you focus on relationships, magic things happen. That's really what relationship-led growth is all about. It's a mindset shift. what it is a go-to-market framework that builds strong relationships across the entire industry ecosystem. Again, I highly encourage you to listen to and watch the episode I did about the referral flywheel, really get into details there. But that ecosystem as a whole, right? And again, asking yourself the question, is there an external party or influencer that needs to guide this conversation is important when you're creating content. That could lead you to a co-marketing opportunity. And that might be your best bet for starting conversations, because there might be somebody better to drive that discussion, which then benefits your business. Okay. This referral flywheel creates what we call relationship velocity. You know, people talk about pipeline velocity, yes, but really relationship velocity. How quickly are you able to build relationships with the right people? That doesn't just mean influencer or doesn't just mean decision makers. It means influencers, partners, employees, current and past, co-workers, current and past, all these things. Again, please listen to and watch the episode about the relationship flywheel. I'll grab a link to that. I'll post it in the comments here in a minute. And again, the idea here is this is really going to help you turn your referral channel into a scalable and sustainable growth channel, growth framework. And it's going to have positive impacts on your unit economics, positive impacts on your pipeline and pipeline velocity, and all the revenue metrics that we all love to look at and focus on. So that's the idea around conversation magnets. Okay, the core idea here is the mindsets. So with that, I know I was running way late. If anyone's, the folks who are here, you're probably staying on well past what you're planning on, so appreciate that. If you have a question, please ask it, pop it in the chat. I'll be happy to address it. I've got time on my end, but I want to make sure I can answer any questions that exist. Otherwise, if you want to reach out to me personally, please do, and we can chat one-on-one as well. Give a few minutes here, see if anybody wants to ask a question. In the meantime, let me grab that the link to the episode I mentioned. All right, let me pop it in the chat here for folks. Here we go. There it is. In case you want it there, make it live. Actually, no one's going to copy that address. I'll pop it into, for anybody that's on YouTube, let me pop it in there as well. All right, I was doing one of these on my phone. This one I got to do on my computer. So there we go. All right, I'm gonna wrap it up with that. If anyone's got any questions on the concept, wants to talk about some of the examples in more detail, has an idea, if you have an idea of your own that you're debating whether it fits these criteria that I discussed or this framework, you want to, bounce it off of me or someone else on our team, please don't hesitate to reach out. Always happy to chat with anybody. And thank you for joining Relationship Led Growth Live. And we'll see you all next week.